Aloha, everyone from Honolulu, Hawaii. I'm Helen Baroni, and I'm playing host this evening. Our apologies for the late start. There were some technical difficulties. So welcome to our fifth and final installment of the Buddhism in a Sea of Islands webinar series. Today, Sally Mccarrah and Mark Mullins will present to us on Buddhism in Aotearoa, New Zealand, multiple sources and diverse forms. We'll be following the usual format with our presenters speaking for approximately 45 minutes, followed by approximately 45 minutes of question and answer at the end. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Sally Mccarrah has authored several publications on Buddhism in Australia and New Zealand, including Land of Beautiful Vision, Making a Buddhist Sacred Place in New Zealand, published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2007. She completed her doctorate at the University of Auckland in 2009 of a major Tibetan Buddhist stupa in rural Victoria, Australia. Her research interests center on Buddhism outside of Asia. Sally is part of the Buddhism in Australia Research Network and is an honorary research fellow in theological and religious studies at the University of Auckland. She's also a student of Zen and an active member of the New Zealand Buddhist Council. Dr. Mark Mullins is currently professor of Japanese Studies and director of the Japan Studies Center at the University of Auckland. After he joined the university in 2013, or before he joined the university in 2013, Mark conducted research and taught in Japan for 27 years at various universities, including Shikoku Gakuin, Meiji Gakuin, Sophia University, and he served as the editor of Monumenta Nipponica, one of the major journals in the field, for 3 years. He completed his postgraduate studies in sociology of religion and East Asian traditions at McMaster University in 1985. In recent years, his research has focused on religious nationalism, which he addressed in Disasters and Social Crisis in Contemporary Japan, Political, Religious, and Sociocultural Responses, co-edited with Koichi Nakano, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2016. And in his latest book, Yasukuni Fundamentalism, Japanese Religions and the Politics of Restoration, published this year by the University of Hawaii Press. And now, Sally, over to you.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Right. So I'll begin with, normally in the rest of the seminar series, people have been starting with the acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land, as people are now doing customarily in Australia. And in New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand, we often begin with a mihi, which depending on the fluency of the speaker, will either be in te reo Māori or in English or in a mixture. So I'll just mostly be speaking in English here. So tēnā tātou katoa. To start with, we acknowledge and pay respect to all peoples around Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, the Pacific Ocean, and all tangata whenua, peoples of the land, including the tangata whenua of the region where I live, Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, and that includes a list here: Ngāti Paua, Ngai Tai, Te Waiohua, Ngāti Whatua o Orake, Ngāti Te Ata, and Te Kawerau a Maki. And also the tangata whenua of where Mark lives, the region of Waipa, Ngāti Haua and Ngāti Koriki Kahukura. We also acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians of the lands wherever you are watching this seminar. So a little bit about my own background. I was already introduced, so I don't need to say too much. I am a practicing Buddhist. I first came across Buddhism in the early 90s after a bereavement. And I was involved with various different convert Buddhist groups that were meditation oriented. In the last 14 years, I've been involved in the Auckland Zen Centre. And over the last, from between about 2007 and last year, I've been involved on the exec of the New Zealand Buddhist Council. And that's really been wonderful in bringing me into contact with all sorts of diverse Buddhist groups from around Aotearoa, New Zealand. And also at the same time, during my postgrad studies in anthropology, social anthropology, I did both Masters and PhD, in which I was looking at the material culture of convert Buddhism in both Australia and New Zealand, as mentioned in the intro that Helen gave. And Mark might like to say something about himself now. Mark, are you speaking? I can't see.
Okay, sorry for the technical challenges. Helen already gave me a nice introduction. I should perhaps just mention that my own research on Buddhism started in 1978, so it dates me a bit. I was a graduate student in Canada. I did my master's research on Zen Buddhism, looking at Zen within North America and in relation to the counterculture movement. A little field participant observation at Vancouver Zen Center, and also attended the Mount Baldy Zen Center seminar on the sutras. I guess it was in 1978 or 9, with Joshu Sasaki Roshi and Gajin Nagao, the Buddhist philosopher from Kyoto. Robert Thurman was there early days as a up-and-coming Tibetan Buddhist scholar, and Leonard Cohen. So I was exposed to quite a range of scholarship and experience from that project. When I finished my MA, I went to McMaster, and I spent the next 4 years working on religion in the Japanese Canadian immigrant community, looking at Jodo Shinshu, the Pure Land tradition that has a number of temples across Canada, North America, United States as well. And when I finished that project, moved back to Japan and worked on other things. My interest in Buddhism in New Zealand developed after I moved here in 2013. Auckland, of course, is kind of the gateway city, and there are several 100,000 Asian immigrants that have settled in Auckland. So you really feel it's an Asian city, and perhaps that's why I felt at home when I moved here. But I became interested again in the role of religion in Asian diaspora communities. And I started a little mini project trying to map and document the development of new religious institutions by these Asian communities, particularly Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. And I found some 200 new institutions. As it turns out, only 20 of them were Buddhist. So I was quite interested this year to collaborate with Sally and kind of cast the net a little wider beyond Northeast Asian immigrants to include South Asians and also the Pakeha, or the European heritage Buddhists, to get a better handle and picture of what's going on with Buddhism in New Zealand. So that's where I am, kind of away from Buddhist studies for a while, but this is my chance to become familiar with what's going on with Buddhism here. And one of my big interests is what happens to a religion when it crosses cultural boundaries. How is it accepted? How is it reinterpreted and practiced in new ways? I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Carry on, Sally.
Thanks. Cool. Just to let you know what's coming up in this presentation, we'll start with some bit of context, history, and developments. Mark will be talking about the changes in immigration policy, what census data reveals about Buddhism in New Zealand, and I'll be talking a bit about what I found out about Buddhist organisations by looking through our charities register, and that will be the wrap up after that. Just for anyone who doesn't know much about Aotearoa, New Zealand, Aotearoa is a name that was originally applied to the North Island of New Zealand. It translates as land of long white cloud, but it's nowadays increasingly people are wanting to use it instead of New Zealand, because New Zealand is very much associated with colonisation. There's a little bit of debate about whether it's the most appropriate word out of other names for New Zealand as well, but that's one that seems to be most often used. Just the words tangata whenua and tangata tiriti I'm mentioning here just because I mentioned the tangata whenua in my mihi at the beginning. Tangata tiriti is everyone else other than the indigenous people in Aotearoa, in other words, people who are here because the treaty of that tiriti is referring to the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed in 1840 between Māori chiefs and the Crown. And the word Pākehā is often used here. And again, there are different views on whether or not it should be used, but I'm happy to identify as a Pākehā and a tangata tiriti. It means Kiwis of British and European ancestry in most cases. Sometimes people can use it as an equivalent to tangata tiriti. And Mark will be talking more about religions in New Zealand in general, but just to say that since colonization, it's been predominantly a Christian country, but yeah, increasingly there's a lot more diversity, which looking at Buddhism is just one interwoven strand of. And just for anyone who might be on this video seminar that doesn't know where New Zealand is, this is a map of Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, the Pacific Ocean, showing where we are down in the colder parts of the Pacific. So next I'll be talking, the next section will be, it's got a few parts to it, so I'm giving an intro to it. I'll be talking about Chinese gold miners, a bit about convert Buddhism right through from the Theosophists through to the baby boomer generation and a little more recently. And then we'll be talking a bit about immigration from Asian Buddhist countries and multi-ethnic groups as well. So I found this photo on Te Ara. It's a New Zealand encyclopedia. On the left is Reverend Alexander Don, whose dates are down in the caption there, and several Chinese gold miners. Alexander Don had learned Cantonese and went to try and missionize the Chinese gold miners. He was not particularly successful at that, but he did document a lot about the Chinese gold miners, and it's just about everything that's known about these Chinese gold miners is from his writings. He noted that in their homes they had makeshift shrines representing bodhisattvas, and these were mostly stones just in a little pile that represented bodhisattvas. And he didn't like them having these things in their homes. He said, when I spoke of the uselessness of these posat, they said, they're of use in China. They said, moreover, Chinese must have posat. They are different from Europeans. And he tended to be, in various ways in his writings, he came across as he was very judgmental towards them, so that which may explain why he wasn't a terribly successful at making converts. But he also found that they had a Buddhist tract, whose title he translated as the Book of Exhortation to Do Good. And he translated this in some Presbyterian journals, and I'm hoping to get hold of that one day. I haven't yet, but it's probably the first ever Buddhist tract to come in New Zealand. The first census that recorded Buddhists in New Zealand wasn't until 1926. And I think the number was 126 was recorded at that time. And so it was presumably most likely to be people from China, possibly from other countries, but we don't have more information about the ethnicity. So this is once over lightly of all these different topics. We haven't got much time to go into detail, but as what was happening in Europe, Pali and Sanskrit texts have been increasingly translated into European languages, and there were theosophists, freethinkers, rationalists, other kind of alternative forms of religion and philosophy that were becoming, always had a kind of minority following among the elites in Europe and USA and also in New Zealand. Meanwhile, in Asia, Buddhism, some forms of Buddhist thinking were undergoing a kind of modernism in response to colonization, which has been well documented elsewhere. And the kind of Buddhism that these theosophists, freethinkers, rationalists, and so on were coming across was that kind of Buddhist modernism. I'll also talk a little bit in a second about the first Buddhist societies. The first Buddhist society of all in New Zealand that we know of was published a leaflet, a 10-page leaflet called Buddhism, What It Is, in 1956. And I have managed to come across in an art catalogue a photograph of Mervyn Riley in the centre there, who was the founder of that Buddhist society and published that leaflet, and Paul Hope and Gabriel Hope. Gabriel Hope was an artist, and it was in an art catalogue about her that I found this picture. So that was a 1958 Buddhist society meeting. But when I looked at, I looked quite some time ago at the two leaflets published by the Buddhist Society, and they were, I don't know, more kind of a mixture of Mervyn Riley's esoteric ideas, partly influenced by Western esoteric ideas and theosophy. I suspect. I haven't spent much time on that, so that's just my first impression. And of course, from the 1970s onwards, there was a lot more happening with convert Buddhism because of the counterculture, which the baby boomers were many people in the baby boomer generation exploring counterculture. Likewise, at that time, there was much more affordable travel, and right through Europe, North America, and lots of other countries as well, the interest in Buddhism was growing at this time, but mainly through books and through teachers touring, but also through then people contacting Buddhism in Asian countries and bringing it back. So in New Zealand in particular, there's a master's honours thesis by Hadley Tiddy, and he talks about one particular event, which I'm going to go into more detail on the next slide. But he talks about seeding from other countries. So you could talk about things like teachers coming here to visit and giving tours around the country and maybe teaching a retreat or giving a few talks. There's the first centres, some of them established by students of those teachers, and people. There were even people who trained in monasteries or so on overseas and would come back. So I'm getting distracted by something on my screen. They would come back from countries like Thailand or Korea and teach here. But 1973 was a particularly interesting year because there were 3 Buddhist retreats at least that happened in that year. One of the first of these that I'll mention is Gal Rinpoche, whose people in New Zealand would know probably. He was based in Canada. He was originally Canadian, and he taught in many places of the world, around the world. But he came with students to New Zealand to give a 3-month retreat in Lake Rotoiti in the North Island, and there may have been up to 80 participants. Most of them were from overseas, and 3 months very intensive retreat that he taught. And then some of those students stayed in New Zealand and ended up founding the Wangapeka Retreat Centre in the South Island, and there are a few teachers connected with his lineage still in New Zealand today. Another retreat that happened in 1973 was when Joshu Sasaki came to New Zealand for the first time. He came several more times. In 1972, the Dinkyoji Society had formed to bring him to the country to teach retreats, and the Dinkyoji Society later became the Zen Society of New Zealand, and ended up that the various other Zen groups that have emerged since then were at that time people who were involved in the Zen Society of New Zealand. But in this photo, I was very, very fortunate to get this photo. It was from my second cousin, Johnny Hayden, who's the son of Molly McAllister, and Molly McAllister was my mother's cousin. So there's a nice unexpected family connection came out of that research. And also in 1973, the other first was a Tibetan Buddhist retreat, and Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa ended up founding what became the foundation for the preservation of the Mahayana tradition, which is the organisation International Buddhist Network, which I studied, which was in Australia, the Australian project building a great stupa in Australia. So again, yet another international Buddhist network kind of that began. It was just gathering steam in the early 70s, and there are, I think, 3 retreats. There's a centre in Auckland, one in Coromandel, and one in Nelson in New Zealand that all connect back to that lineage. So Mark's going to present our next section when you're ready, Mark, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Can everyone see the screen again and hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So my role here today is to highlight some of the information we gleaned from the New Zealand Census from 1991 to 2018. So over the course of several decades, what are some of the patterns that we were able to distill from the data, particularly looking at what's going on with religion across New Zealand, but also particularly changes in immigration that impacted the changing composition and increasing Asian influence on Buddhism in New Zealand. First, just a couple of things about the larger context, and secularization here is the key word. One of the things that you can observe is this steady increase in the number of people choosing no religion when they're questioned about their religious identity or affiliation, and it's grown to 49%. So roughly half of the population is disaffected by religion or organized religion and identifies themselves as non-religious. The percentage of Christians similarly has declined, and from 58% in 2001 down to 38%. And what we see is that a pattern that's very similar to what you would find in Australia or Canada, or even earlier back in Western Europe. The traditional established Christian denominations are steadily declining. Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, those familiar denominations. Some of the smaller evangelical Pentecostal groups might be recording some modest growth, but basically the picture is one of decline. In this context of decline, what we also have is counter trends. And this is primarily related to immigration patterns, the arrival of many new immigrants from around the world, and especially from areas of the world where people still hold a stronger sense of religious identity. And some of this is leading to revitalization of religion, but certainly the diversification of religion. No, I'm not. Oh, there we go. I'm sorry, I wasn't able to change the slides. So one of the things I'd like to highlight is this diversification. And one of the things that you see is an increase in the population of Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, and Sikhs. And so now Buddhism is about 1% of this 5% of religious diversity of alternative religions to the traditional Christian tradition, which had dominated New Zealand. So the growth of the Asian immigrant population and the growth of Buddhism is closely connected to how immigration changed in the late 80s. The government established a new policy regulating immigration that shifted the criteria from preferred country of origin, which had been the UK and Ireland for a century and a half, to a point system that prioritized education, work experience, and the potential for capital investment in New Zealand. So these were the conditions that would attract and also allow for the increase of immigrants from Asian countries, both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. And the fact that Buddhism was well established in most of these countries, at least for some centuries, it's no surprise that they became carriers of diverse forms, both linguistically and culturally, of Buddhism and its transplantation. So what does the census tell us about the Buddhist population? And we were fortunate to get the census data from 1991 through to 2018. There's some shifts and turns, but basically you see steady growth from 12,000 in 1991 to 52,000 in 2018 after a drop off from 2013. We'll come back to this chart, but you'll see especially the drop off here for Buddhists of European ethnic background almost 5,000. So the slight decline between 2013 and 2018 is related to the European background composition of the population. But overall, the Buddhist population has grown from roughly just over 3%, almost 4%, to just over 1% of the population. As someone that worked on religion in Japan for many years, it's interesting to note that the Christian population is roughly 1% in Japan. So you have a similar kind of minority presence established and having some influence. One of the, just to highlight a couple of things here, the growth of and decline of the European ethnic background that I just mentioned, it was steady growth until 2001, and we had this significant drop-off in 2018. So from 27% of the total of Buddhists being of European background, it dropped to 16% of that total in 2018. So during this time period, you had a significant influx of Asian immigrants. And so that now roughly you have 80% of the Buddhist population drawing on the Northeast Asian, Southeast Asian Buddhist immigrants. We've been puzzled by this drop-off in the European Buddhist in this one period. And all we can do is speculate. Sally suggested perhaps it's related to the aging cohort that really experienced Buddhism in the 60s and 70s and now is getting up in age and sort of disappearing. We could also look into the larger trend of disaffection from organized religion. It may be reflecting an overall kind of tendency to abandon organized forms of religion that's going on. In any case, in 2018, what we have is a Buddhism in New Zealand that is roughly 80% associated with the Asian immigrant population. Now, when we think about this, the place of Buddhism in these Asian communities and New Zealand as a whole, we have to think about how they line up. So there is a religious economy, and you have no religion as a very substantial category. You have those that are choosing Buddhism, but you also will have Christianity as one of the competitors in this religious economy. But as you can see in this graph, there's quite a wide variety here and variation between those who come in with a very strong secular orientation or being disconnected from religion. Northeast Asia is prominent here with Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, Vietnamese also there. But you'll see at the other end that South Asian immigrants, they tend to come with a stronger religious identity. And that plays out in the other data that we'll see. One of the very interesting things is the place of Christianity within this Asian population. And there are some surprises here. You'll see the strong no religion at the top here with the Northeast Asian group. And Buddhist affiliation actually very low for those from Northeast Asia. Those with Chinese or Japanese or Korean background tend to identify the least with Buddhism as their religion. And what's really striking here is that in the case of immigrants from or with this ethnic background, you'll see that the Christian identification of these immigrants is higher than Buddhist in both among the Chinese, Japanese, and especially the Korean. But if we look at South Asia, we'll see the figures jump way up so that you have a very strong Buddhist identification, a much lower Christian identification, among the South Asian groups. But this is an interesting development. One would anticipate more Buddhist identification across the board in Asia, but this reflects some of the changes going on. I have a PhD student now trying to figure out what's going on in the Japanese community, and this increase from 1% Christian in Japan to almost 10% in New Zealand. Why this shift in religious identification? It's an interesting project. In any case, just a few generalizations to highlight about the Asian heritage Buddhists. Overall, there's lower rates of Buddhist identification among Northeast Asians. There's a great variation among the Buddhist identification and among the Chinese. So overall, it's low, but it's quite high on subcategories of the Chinese. For example, Cambodian Chinese, it's very high, 47%. It goes down to 14 or 15% for Taiwanese, and then only 5.4% for Hong Kong. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, the rates for Christian identification are surprisingly high for Northeast Asian immigrants, but Buddhist identification is clearly the highest for Sinhalese, Thai, and Cambodian. Finally, the census data did allow for respondents to designate a particular Buddhist tradition, Theravada, Nichiren, so on, or simply kind of the generic Buddhist category not further defined. And you'll see that the large majority here selected this category of just generic Buddhism, so to speak. And we don't know exactly why this happened. Either there's not a strong sense of identity with a denominational tradition or one of the transplanted temples, or simply there's a language problem. Recent immigrants or may not know these English categories of the different types of Buddhism and simply choose not to select one of them. But what we'll see as Sally takes over to look at the organized forms of religion, all of these different traditions are represented in New Zealand now, in the different Northeast Asian and the Southeast Asian communities, as well as the Pakeha multi-ethnic communities. One last point for me is it's really quite surprising to see Japanese traditional Buddhism missing in action in New Zealand, in the sense that decades ago when I was studying North American Japanese Buddhism, you would see a strong missionary presence of Jodo Shinshu, Pure Land Buddhists from Nishihonganji. They would send out their Kai Kyoshi missionary teachers, help establish the temples. And this was very strong in the United States, but also there were a number of established temples in Canada as well. That has not happened in New Zealand, and that reflects, I think, the decline of Buddhism in Japan, the declining aging of the population, low birth rate, shortage of priests, financial problems, so that the established Buddhist traditions in Japan are no longer really in a position to invest much in this sort of overseas missionary activity. I'll stop my share there and turn it back over to Sally to look at some of the organizational forms of Buddhism.
Okay, so in another later part of the paper, we spend some time breaking down what different Buddhist groups that there are and trying to find categories to put them under. And it's a difficult task because every group, there's just so many diverse things, but in order to count the groups in the charities register and come up with some general classifications, I'll go through a few of what we've come up with. This table on this slide, which I should make on full screen. I've got different groups here, affiliate groups of Pakeha or / multi-ethnic groups, affiliate groups of groups with the more generally multi-ethnic affiliate groups of migrant communities, and then centers, which includes both temples and centers of different kinds, and also centers that function as monasteries or retreat centers, and then a few groups which are a bit more difficult to categorize, so I've just put them in a sort of unclear category, and then also some retreat centers that are not particularly monastic. So all these categories are a bit tricky, and we need a lot more information to be sure about each one, but this is our kind of starting point for breaking down, getting an idea of what the different kinds were, and all these groups, the total was 134. But within that charities register, which is, I should say, the charities register was set up in its current form in 2007, and prior to that, charities had a different process, which I don't know much about. But if you look on the charities register, when groups joined, you'll see a large number that joined in 2007 and 2008 as they transferred over to the new register. And at that time, so you can't tell the age of the groups that were set up earlier than that by looking at the register. But as groups applied to become a charity at that time or since, they would fill out various forms in the process, and some of the fields from those forms are visible when you when you go into the register and search and have a look. So I went through, and other people have also gone through, like some of my friends in the Buddhist Council had also gone through, and they'd come up with a list of, I think it was something like 90 organizations, and I went through again and tried a few more search categories as well, and I came up with a few more, and some new ones, usually one or two new ones are appearing in there every year. But between all those kind of groups, just broadly, the types of groups, this the one umbrella organisation, the New Zealand Buddhist Council. Then you could say, in terms of the kind of approach to Buddhism, they don't necessarily specify this in the register, but you can tell by looking at the group to some extent and make an educated guess that some are Theravada, Mahayana, or Vajrayana, and sometimes it might be a combined approach. You can see to some extent whether a group is set up as a monastery or a retreat centre. Some of them are temple centres or small offshoot groups. You can only tell a limited amount of that. You can tell a little bit about the size of the group because you can see financial statements, so you can get a sense of how much money those groups are putting through their books. That gives it, to some extent, an idea of their size. Sometimes they will say whether or not they're connected to some overseas Buddhist group, or sometimes it was because I knew something about them or found out something about them by looking them up online. But usually it wasn't that kind of information is not in the register itself, but it's usually very easy to find that out when you look a group up online. And sometimes it might be a Facebook group, sometimes it might be a website of an international organisation. And then quite a number, as you saw on the previous table, are affiliate groups. That was this table here, especially the Pākehā multi-ethnic groups that tended to have a lot of small groups in different cities around the country. So that was those. And of course, in terms of how they set themselves up, the majority of them were charitable trusts. There is at least one quite long established Zen group in New Zealand that chose not to register as a charity. So the charities register is not going to give us every single group, and there are many small groups that wouldn't go through that process because it's quite onerous to remain in the register every year, to remain registered. So some of the exclusions, I would find groups in the register that appeared to be Buddhist, but sometimes I would have to make a call on whether I was going to include them in my count. And I might have excluded a few that were, for some reason or other, I couldn't be sure they were Buddhist first and foremost. There were some groups that appeared to be more, in terms of what they wrote about themselves in their description in the register, they would say more about Taoism and Confucianism, say, than Buddhism. So in 2 or 3 cases, especially if it was in their name that they were Confucian and Buddhism was only mentioned as a by the by, then I might not count that group. But that kind of issue is an ongoing one that really would take a lot more work to research and find out about the groups and decide on criteria more clearly over time. There are a number of deregistered groups in the charities register. So again, it would take more research to find out whether that group no longer existed at all, or whether it's just that was too onerous to maintain charities registration. So again, more research needed. And then there was quite a number of groups which I excluded from my count just because they appeared to be set up for a purpose other than a Buddhist congregation. So for example, a group that was set up, a charity that might be set up specifically to manage funds as a kind of adjunct to another charitable organization that was representing the temple. But yeah, this is a big learning curve for me because I've not been really familiar in terms of legal structures of Buddhist organizations or anything like that. So again, yeah, a lot more further research would be needed to go into more detail on that. So I did come up with 3 types overall of organisation for writing when we were writing the paper in order to group them together a bit more. And this is based on mostly on ethnicity, which in some of the literature on Western Buddhism, it's been seen as problematic to focus on ethnicity, but because of the data we're using, like census data and charities register, it's a useful tool for the time being, but it's really just a beginning. So we have migrant centers that are mostly set up for, say, a refugee community, a community that writes as refugees or more recent migrants. And when I say I've got this category, Pākehā multi-ethnic, which is primarily converts of New Zealand European background, but I say multi-ethnic as well because not everyone who goes to those groups is actually of Pākehā background. They may be from, we've got people in the Zen Centre from many different parts of the world. And then I've talked about multi-ethnic organisations because these are, I'll show you some examples of each of these soon. Multi-ethnic organisations, quite a varied combination, and maybe no one group is dominant. So I'll start with kinds of migrant Buddhism. We have mainly people who came to Aotearoa as refugees, and then more migrant sources from many countries, especially Northeast Asia, after 1987. So in terms of a representative, I've got 2 representatives here of Southern or Theravada Buddhism. The first one's the Laotian Community in Aotearoa, which is South Auckland, and that's Wat Lao Buddharam. They acquired this bungalow in South Auckland in about 1986 and a neighbouring property as well, and now have converted that into their temple. They have beautiful festivals and things there. I've had the pleasure of visiting a couple of times. And another Theravada Buddhist temple, a very well-established temple called Sri Lanka Temple, representing the Sri Lankan community. And this particular occasion, you can see their stupa in the background, and you can see that they had a blood donation drive. They do several of these every year, but especially in the summer period, which in New Zealand, of course, is the Christmas, New Year break period, where there's often sadly need for more blood because of the road toll at that time of year, the holiday season. And so they do a bunch of community-oriented activities like that. And of course, a group isn't necessarily entirely Theravada or Mahayana. There's a Korean monastery near Kerikeri in Northland, and their founder, the nun Yasala Bante, she's actually Korean but trained in Theravada Buddhism as well as Mahayana Buddhism, and I've just got this snapshot from their website showing a few people from that group. And there's a Korean temple out in West Auckland, and that's just a traditional Buddhist birthday festival celebration with lanterns. And of course, the people may well know about the largest Buddhist temple in New Zealand, very prominent Tang Dynasty style building built by Fo Guangshan, the International Buddhist Network founded in Taiwan, which is hosting this seminar series among others. And another Taiwanese/Chinese diaspora in Fushian Temple in Ellerslie, and Master Changlin there, the founder, is chanting at the front there. So now on to kinds of convert Buddhism. This is an area I've got a bit more background. I can speak from a bit more experience other than just visiting a few temples. And from when these groups first began, most of them were collaborative for people, like, for example, in Zen groups, several people following different Zen teachers, perhaps collaborating to bring a teacher out to teach a retreat in early days when there weren't many people. But more over time, groups would tend to distill out into single lineage groups as resources and people coalesced around particular lineages. Most of the kinds of convert Buddhism today you would find were, as Anne Glegg has pointed out in her writing on American Dharma, she talks about how they're the sources of such forms of Buddhism that converts follow tended to be mostly modernized in the country they came from before they were adopted by converts. And we have ecumenical or eclectic types of Buddhism, and that includes the Triratna group, which used to be known as Friends of Western Buddhist Order, which is a group I used to take part in myself and that I wrote my master's thesis about, which was drawing on different forms of Theravada, Mahayana and Tibetan practices. So there's a number of different groups like that are a little eclectic. And of course there are secular forms such as the International Vipassana Foundation that teaches they're quite well known for their 10-day silent retreats that many people go to because they're offered free of charge just by donation. And most of the convert Buddhist groups, of course, are meditation based, but of course Soka Gakkai is an interesting exception for various reasons, but certainly one of them being that they base their practice on chanting rather than meditation. And another area of convert Buddhism which can't be ignored is what you could call Buddhist sympathizers, people who don't identify as Buddhist but are influenced quite deeply in some way. They may read a lot of books, they may even attend retreats and follow a teacher, but they don't want to call themselves Buddhist. And of course that in the census figures, many of those people might have put no religion. So the Pākehā multi-ethnic category, a little bit more about them. Just although they're mostly meditation based, they may well take part in other activities, not just study groups and talks, but also rituals and ceremonies, such as in this photo at the Auckland Zen Centre, family oriented bathing the baby Buddha ceremony. And I mentioned multi-ethnic Buddhist organisations. So the Theravada Buddhist Associations, there were several formed around New Zealand. There was the Auckland Theravada Buddhist Association, the Wellington Theravada Buddhist Association. Those two are the longest established and are still around today. Both of them went on to establish monasteries and bring monks to teach in them, including some New Zealanders who trained in Thailand and the Thai Forest Sangha, and also an American monk as well. And Soka Gakkai International was also a very multi-ethnic group and really diverse. And in the US, they're well known as being very, very ethnically diverse compared to the more generally white convert Buddhist groups that were, at least during the baby boomer generation, quite white. And Soka Gakkai has always been more multi-ethnic and more diverse social class background as well. And here's just one photo of an arms round ceremony at Vermouth Buddhist Monastery, which is south of Auckland, and that's established by the Auckland Theravada Buddhist Association. And basically it's quite interesting in this photo because the monk is the American monk Ajahn Chandakol, and the lay people dressed in white and giving alms and taking part in ceremonies are mostly, as I say, Sri Lankan and so on, and also Malaysian, Thai, and various other communities. But in these multi-ethnic Buddhist communities, the lingua franca is usually English, but say the Sri Lankan temple that I showed in an earlier slide, the majority of the time people will be speaking in Sri Lankan. In Sinhalese, they will have events that are for the maintenance of the language and culture, as well as the spiritual religious events. So they'll have a combination. And the other multi-ethnic group I mentioned, Soka Gakkai, I've just mentioned that it was very interesting to learn from talking to someone from Camilla from Soka Gakkai about Mrs. Yuki Johnston, who she was from Hiroshima, and she married a New Zealand soldier in 1964. She came to New Zealand at a time when there was no one else in the 1960s, no one else around that she could relate to in terms of her following Nichiren Buddhism. But she ended up being the founding mother of what became the first chapter or district of Soka Gakkai in 1975. So again, another one of those sort of founding events in the 70s. But today, as you can see in this snapshot from the Soka Gakkai website, actually that's not so recent, but it gives you the impression of the broad diversity of people in Soka Gakkai today. And I mentioned that there were all these different kinds of approaches to Buddhism, and many of these groups have very little interaction with each other. And sometimes, for example, in the Tri Ratna Buddhist group, the Western Friends, when I was involved with Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, I would say there are many people in that group who'd never been to any other kind of Buddhist center at all. And that's quite common, because you then go to, say, a Buddhist center from maybe from people from Taiwan or wherever, that they may not be that involved or aware of the many other kinds of Buddhism. It's quite common. It's like they're each operating in their own community, and what they're doing is taking all of their spare time, so they haven't really got time to go out and check out the other Buddhist groups. But so the Buddhist Council, one of the reasons it was set up was to foster sharing, respect and collaboration between all these Buddhist communities. So that's a way of trying to bring everything together, at least so that people are more aware of each other, and when there are issues of mutual concern, to kind of work together on them. And I haven't got time to go into the conclusion, but I'm putting these questions up here just as potential talking points for Q&A.
Thank you, Sally and Mark, for your wonderful presentation. Yeah, we just had a fairly lively little comment thread around well, first of all, it was around, Mark mentioned some of your hypotheses about why there might be a decline of affiliation to Buddhists among the European converts. So we just had a bit of an exchange there where I think I was saying that in addition to what Mark said, it seems that Buddhism is not as fashionable as it was, say, a couple of decades ago. Can you hear me okay? My connection's pretty bad.
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Oh, great. And but that also what I found quite interesting, because, you know, in the literature, there's always this sense where we're looking at so-called Asian Buddhist or ethnic Buddhists and Western Buddhists as two very separate things. But I actually suspect that what is going on here is also very similar to what's happening in Asian Buddhist communities, where it's a issue pertaining to intergenerational transmission and difficulty of that baby boomer generation of really translating Buddhism, you know, into younger generations. And also in my own personal experience, because I'm a Gen X, not a baby boomer, of them also letting us participate in kind of leadership or really have some meaningful involvement. It seems some Western Buddhist organizations I've been involved in personally are very like top-down heavy in terms of who has the leadership. And anyway, so I think there's some issues going on there that might be interesting to tease out with further research. And I think it was Roy mentioned Kim Lam's research on young Buddhists in Oz. And then so I don't know if other people want to comment and further sort of, you know, someone might have some more ideas there. And then the other things we were talking about was just, as you then got onto later in your slides, Sally, was just these different types of Buddhists. Like it may be that people are not ticking that question, ticking the box Buddhist in terms of religious affiliation, but they could still be very much engaged in Buddhist practices in a so-called secular way or a modern non-religious way, or as nightstand Buddhists, you know, as they've been labeled, or other things. And then we were really interested in the Buddhist buildings that you were showing us. And I was like, I think that could be a really also interesting area for the network to explore further. And that Emma Tomlin and Carolyn Starkey have done some really great work on Buddhist buildings in the UK, and we've done a little bit drawing on their work on Buddhist buildings in Australia. But I think, yeah, there's much more that could be done there, and comparatively. And then, Helen, I did finally ask a question, but to you and Venerable Lekshen, not to Mark and Sally, just about the Buddhist councils.
We have one.
Okay, that's really interesting to know. Yeah.
Yeah, we have the Hawaii Association of International Buddhists. I was on that council for a while, but that was before children. And then I stepped back and haven't rejoined. So I haven't been involved for 2 decades.
Actually do. There's the Hawaii Buddhist Council, which is comprised of about 7 different Japanese Buddhist denominations. And we started Hawaii Association of International Buddhists because they didn't want any non-Japanese involved in the Hawaii Buddhist Council. And when we asked why, they said that because they spoke Japanese. And I said, but many of us speak Japanese. They said no. So we started the Hawaii Association of International Buddhists in about 1992, 91, 92. Yeah, and it's still going strong. I'm still involved with it.
Yeah. So thanks for those comments. Just one comment I wanted to make also about, which we do discuss in passing in the paper itself, about the last census and how there seem to be fewer convert Buddhists. And I recognize the term convert as a problematic one, but it's just a matter of trying to find some quick shorthand term. And then definitely there's space elsewhere to go into more detail on that. But the thing about the most recent census in 2018 was that it was administered online for the first time, and perhaps a lot of the older people didn't want to take part in a digital census online, and older generation in general. I know of some who didn't take part in it for that reason, just didn't really want to do it online, or didn't have access. And the other thing is that in terms of younger people, and I certainly come across in studying convert Buddhists, I've definitely come across a number of people who wouldn't want to call themselves either a convert or a Buddhist. So this is just a sociological way of grouping together people to talk about them. But yeah, certainly people have strongly told me, no, I'm not Buddhist, I'm not religious, I don't like religion, don't like organized religion. And I've even had some Zen friends tell me, when they saw the census and they saw there was an option to tick Zen, they ticked that, but they also ticked no religion so that they could show that they were not religious. Yeah. So these categories are for sociologists to talk and think about, anthropologists and sociologists and other scholars, not what are meaningful to the people who are practicing often. So I guess we've got to bear that in mind. Yeah.
While we wait for a question, I have a question for you all. Here in Hawaii, a lot of the drop in Buddhist numbers, it has to do with the older generation of Asian Americans aging, dying, so that the aging of the membership has been an issue, and the older generations have passed now largely. But a larger part of the drop for the younger generations is to Christianity. And are you seeing anything of that in New Zealand? This is from, I'm not talking about immigrant populations, because Japanese and Chinese have been in Hawaii for 5 generations. So, but many of them have converted and have become Christian.
Let me just respond briefly to that. One of the things we're finding here is this shift in numbers, at least for Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, to a much higher percentage. It's still not big, but it's bigger than the Buddhist identification. And you have to distinguish between those who might convert when they get here and groups that are actually strong. For example, there are Korean churches establishing their denominations in New Zealand now.
Yes. And
if they're not doing that, for example, the Presbyterian Church in Korea is very strong. Well, when they come to New Zealand, they're revitalizing the declining Pakeha kind of Presbyterian denomination. So you kind of have this revitalization going on with some Asian immigrants. It's not a huge kind of shift, but even at the University of Auckland, it's quite interesting. If you go to the university chapel, it's quite full of Asian Christians, you know, and not Pakeha European background Christians. So it has a real Asian kind of Christian flavor to the atmosphere. So I have a student who's working on this and how it's transpiring in the Japanese community in New Zealand. So she's doing a lot of interviews. And I've noticed some of the comments about people saying Buddhism is not a religion. It's quite interesting that some of those who are affiliating and becoming Christian in Auckland are saying, oh, it's not a religion. It's my personal relationship, or it's my personal faith. And as many of you may know, in Japan, most Japanese say they're mushu, without religion, and organized religion has a terrible image, a negative image. It's associated with organizations that use high pressure techniques, or there's all sorts of sexual or financial scandals. So you don't want to be associated with an organized religion. So that's even passing over into New Zealand with these Japanese that, yeah, it's not a religion. Even though I'm kind of involved in this new Christian faith. So I understand many Buddhists would say, you know, I'm secular or I'm not religious, and they don't define it as religion, but that happens in more traditions than Buddhist.
Paul Morris, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to ask it?
Allow me, Mazu. I'm happy to ask it myself. It was, I'm just typing another one, but the question I raised, I'll just read what I've written, but I enjoyed the photographs very, very much. And I'm of that era and remember Roshi Sasaki coming to teach us about Zen when I was a religious studies student at Victoria in 74, or it may have been 75. I was interested in Mark's idea of new diaspora institutional forms and concerns. And for part of a project I've been doing with Auckland City, which Mark knows about, which is on disaster and emergency responses, one of our hui was hosted at the Taiwanese Tzu Chi temple in Auckland. And there are quite a large group turned out of Taiwanese, many New Zealand born or have grown up in New Zealand. It's a center for their Chinese language studies. But talking to them, they don't meditate, they don't read sutras. They say they aren't competent to read sutras or to meditate, but their woman Taiwanese leader is suitably qualified in this way. And they talk about, and they use this expression over again, Buddhism expressed via social work. And they direct this to their own community, both in terms of the Taiwanese community, their local community, and increasingly in a kind of interreligious sense. And with a very powerful sense that this is a religious activity. That's their own terminology. So I was very interested in that as a kind of form. And I was interested in what sort of new forms and new concerns that Mark was mapping.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was initially just trying to identify what new, the religious landscape is really changing even before my eyes in just my first decade here. And I was just sort of beginning to try and map, what is this new religious diversity? Where is it appearing? Who's creating it? And my initial surprise was that 80% of it, at least that I had initially documented, was Christian and not Buddhist, because I anticipated a lot more Buddhist influence. That's been coming in with South Asians more than the Northeast Asians. So that's one of the things I've been finding. But initially it was just more geographical. So where is it? Where is it popping up? And I was working with a Purdue scholar who has this mapping software, and see if I can't sort of begin to map it. And you click on your site and you can see what institution is there. And we have these wonderful photos that Sally and other people are pulling together with actual sites that could also populate these sort of mapping sites. So this is just something I've been playing with, but not funded to actually take on in a serious way. And I think it would be a kind of project that collaboration with people like you or others down in Otago, to get a group of people who could, share funding and do this sort of thing. There was some question that this mapping exercise might be intimidating for some people to be put on the map. That is, because of some persecution in China or whatever, they didn't want to be out there and easily identified. But of course, with the internet now, you can identify all these places anyway. It's pretty straightforward, but the mapping sort of exercise, I think, has some potential, and it could sort of clarify the new religious diversity in New Zealand and where it's, we know Auckland and Wellington, a few centers, especially for Asian immigrants, are important, but it's scattered throughout even rural areas and outside of Auckland and some very rural areas as well. But
thank you. Can I just a very quick or two very quick comments. One was just the complexity and the variety which came through, although there wasn't time to dwell on it. Between incredibly different communities, linguistically, culturally, but also in terms of their prosperity. And with radically different notions of what role the Buddhism plays in their lives, and sometimes very perplexing one of the groups I met with is the Burmese Buddhist Association, who deny they're Burmese, don't speak Burmese, are Mons. Speaking and ethnically, and tell me they despise and dislike Burmese, but their name is the Burmese Buddhist Society of Auckland, and so there are real issues about identifications, and they certainly aren't queuing up to be mapped in that sense. And my last comment just on this was the ethnicization of Christianity in New Zealand is a huge and understudied topic. It isn't just Asian migration, but also Asia and Pacific and South African and English migration. And in some of the major denominational churches, not the denominations themselves in Auckland, a third of the population are non-New Zealand born. And but this is generating a very different Catholicism, a different Methodism, a very different Presbyterianism, and is largely unstudied, but refracts those multi-ethnic and Buddhist communities and have similar drivers, perhaps. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a number of questions that are in the chat. I'm going to start with Jane and see if Jane wants to ask a question.
Hi, I guess I was sort of curious about, because you guys took a bit more of an organizational studies approach, or maybe I was reading into it, but I was thinking a bit more about sort of nonprofit organizations and non-NGOs have experienced a considerable amount of sort of transitions and how they've had to change and adapt to, their new sort of place, their elevation in liberal societies, doing a lot more sort of charity work and all of that stuff. So I was just wondering if that's a thing that's relevant for Buddhist organizations, as it's moved through and the social fabric of the societies they're in have changed, and there has been more demand for NGOs and nonprofits to do more. Have Buddhist organizations also experienced similar shifts or drives in terms of being more humanitarian or doing more social engagement and that sort of stuff? And how has that, I guess, affected their structure as Buddhist organizations?
Would you like to speak to that, Sally?
It's a difficult one to answer because it varies so much, and with our research looking across the charities register, it's very onerous for an organisation to meet all the charities requirements every year of the financial reporting and various other things. There's a lot of things, and it requires them to have a knowledgeable treasurer to look after the accounts and all sorts of things. And so some groups I've noticed would deregister for a while and then re-register. Probably depended on having someone available to help them get signed in again and get the right, someone with the right skills to be the treasurer. And all those things are very onerous. In terms of engaged activities in the community, like charity type work, I mean, some groups focus more on those things than others, and some people will focus entirely on teaching the Dharma, and others will say, well, we need to get out there and do things to help others. And the example of that blood donation drive in Sri Lanka Temple would be one example of groups really wanting to get out there and show the community they care. Yeah, does that sort of answer?
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's a trend, I guess, that you would see like in other nonprofits or NGOs, but I guess it is very, very varied by the sounds of it. And
very, yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing I should say, and I hope I stressed this enough, that this is a very, very preliminary piece of research that Mark and I have been both fitting into spare time. It's not funded or anything like that. So it's just really trying to see what information we can get about the varieties of Buddhism in New Zealand through these two main sources, the Charities Register and census data. And a lot more time could be spent on mining that census data more thoroughly, sifting through it a lot more, and the same with the Charities Register. But then those only are really the tip of the iceberg, because if ethnographic studies would find out so much more about what it is like to be practicing in a community, and what people think about the categories we're using and what categories they would use themselves and so on. Yeah.
It's not an easy question to answer, but thank you.
Yeah, I would like to chime in there that the census is handy to get a big picture, but there's so many things you can't get from the census, and that's what ethnographic research is, is why it's required. I mean, getting on the ground, interview people. What did you mean by that? The census data gives you a very limited thing. And it's a place to start, but we know that to move ahead with this, it's just going to require a lot more on the ground ethnographic work in these different various communities to see what's really going on. And also one of the concerns I have is, where is Buddhism practiced? And in Japan, most people practice in home. It's not at the temple. Things happen at the temple sometimes. So, how do we get into documenting where it happens, the Buddhism in everyday life in the household? And even this small town in Cambridge, where I live south of Auckland, 2 hours, there's a friend of mine who's married to a Japanese. She's not in any Buddhist group, but she has an altar in her home and she practices. What's going on there? What does this faith, what does this practice, what does this tradition mean to her as someone from Japan? And I haven't had a chance to talk to her because we're in lockdown and she hadn't been able to get back from her Japan visit to get back in the country, but I'm hoping to have some conversations with her about that. But this year, sort of working on this with Sally, was very much, how can we get kind of a big picture of what's out there and identify some of the areas that really need more serious in-depth work, which requires being on the ground. And one of our worries is now COVID is bringing a lot of restrictions to in-person activities and in-person gatherings, and you sort of wonder about the nature of ethnographic work going forward. I mean, I have students completing PhDs with Zoom interviews, and as you know, in-person encounters, getting to know people, is how you begin to have richer interviews, and it's hard to duplicate all that with just Zoom encounters, but it'll be an interesting to see how research possibilities unfold post-pandemic, if we're ever in that.
And of course, we don't know how it's affecting Buddhist groups, with in New Zealand in particular having a lot of restrictions on how people can get into the country. I mean, it's very, very difficult to get into this country right now because of the managed isolation process that has to be gone through in the limited spaces and so on, due to the pandemic. So I imagine that's really affecting. I know one Taiwanese temple in Auckland, they had so I think their 20th anniversary celebrations lined up just before the pandemic hit, and they had all sorts of people who were going to be coming from various countries for that. But more importantly, what happens about, say, I gather that some temples would bring a teacher or a monk or several monks from, say, Thailand for a stint of however long they could get on their religious worker visa, and then a new monk would come after that, and there would be a circulation. So all those things, they must be really affecting a lot of Buddhist groups.
Harmalecha has a question. Do you want to ask your question directly? Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, I was asking whether you've encountered groups that either temples or centers that have programs for children. Because I've noticed in the States that a lot of the temples that have programs for children, namely the Vietnamese community, the children grow up Buddhists and they speak Vietnamese. Whereas a lot of the other groups, the trend is more toward assimilation and they lose the language and they don't identify as Buddhists. And then, well, Hombo Honganji also has programs for children, and we'd have to, look more into the success of those programs. They tend to be more little league rather than Buddhist education compared to the Vietnamese. What do you find in New Zealand?
Yeah, well, I know that I have heard people talking about this problem, and it does vary from one group to another, of course. The Sri Lanka Temple in South Auckland, I know that they've got a Dharma Sunday school, for example, and I know of others that have had the equivalent of a Sunday school type program for children. And in convert communities, it tends to be quite rare that they will have a program for children. That, although I do know of the Triratna group having family retreats, which are a bit like a kind of camp for families where there's some Buddhist teachings involved. There's a whole range out there, but definitely I know that a number of immigrant temples in particular are concerned about the next generation and how things are going to pan out for them, because they're getting either not interested in religion, not interested in their heritage as much, because there are other things that are grabbing their attention more when they're young and so on. So it can vary a lot.
Thank you.
Robert Hunt, do you want to ask your question next, please?
Well, I think in some ways, perhaps already being answered. Mark or Sally, very fascinating presentation. Thank you. And I was just curious whether any research now or research intended shows anything at all about which migrant ethnicities have more or less dropping out in the second or third generation. I've spoken to some of these communities who've expressed concern in this area of retention. And I wonder if it also relates across to something Jane raised about structure of organizations, because I've observed there are some temples where the trusteeship hasn't changed in a long, long, long time, and you've got 80 and 90-year-old trustees, and whether their vision is appropriate, because you've got that dynamic. Sometimes some migrant folk will tell you that their faith is practiced more conservatively in the expat situation than it is back home. Not always true, but an interesting access, and just wondering if you have any comment or observed anything.
I haven't, and my sense is that so many of the Asian immigrant groups are relatively recent over the last couple of decades or so. They don't have, I mean, we certainly had Chinese immigrants way back a century ago, but in terms of the organizations established in the post-immigration 1987 revised immigration policy, it hasn't been that long. When I was studying Japanese Buddhist in Canada, I had 4 generations to look at. And I was documenting intermarriage rates of the 4th generation and that sort of thing. We're not there yet here. I think the struggle here is, can they make the transition from 1st to 2nd generation? And do you move from an ethnic language to a bilingual kind of service format? That's what happened in many places in the United States and Canada. And I haven't been on the ground to do that kind of field work to confirm that, but I know that a lot of the temple groups might be offering language classes to try and keep the 2nd generation fluent, but that's pretty hard to pull off.
Yes.
Sally may have some more concrete examples from circulating more widely.
Thanks, Mark.
we actually have to wrap up about now. I'm sorry to cut off such a wonderful conversation that's going on. We have some closing remarks. We're coming to the end of the hour, and we have some closing remarks that Anna needs to give us. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Sally, very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, people, for coming.
Yes.
And for your questions.
So thank you again, Helen, for chairing this session, and thank you to Sally and to Mark. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. It's stormy here again, so my connection's not so great. If I crack up too much, can someone just put something in the chat? I can't actually see the screen sharing. That might be to do with my bad connection. Oh, it's coming up now. Well, first of all, I just really wanted to thank Nantien Institute and in particular Venerable Jue, Shu Yang and Grace Ewert and their team for hosting this webinar series. It's been an enormous success, largely because of the audience. So, you know, we're so delighted with the large numbers of participants in every session, including this very last one. So a big thank you also to all the participants. As I said at the beginning, there was apologies from Christina for not being able to be here today because she's in Europe. So I also want to thank Western Sydney University and also thank my colleagues at Deakin University and also Sue Smith from Charles Darwin University. So this very much has been a collaboration across, as you know, Australia, New Zealand and Hawaii. And for many of us, as Mark and Sally have noted, it's not like we've received a big grant and are doing this work. This is actually kind of seeding work ourselves that we're doing out of our own research allocations and research time. But we're really hoping that this network, and the slide is showing details of the network, will enable us to come together. We now can really show a track record of collaboration with this webinar series and also with the special issue that's coming out of the webinar series. Our next network meeting, we're going to have a network meeting. I can't actually see the date there, but maybe Shu Yang can.
Yes. The meeting is on the 27th of October at 3 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time. So that's next Tuesday afternoon.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sorry, my screen is a bit blurry. Those of you who are already members of the network would have got updates about this. If anyone is here today and has not yet expressed an interest in being part of the network, then please contact us. And we can add you to the network and also send you these details. So I think today really has been very valuable because I think we can see some ways forward here. This idea to do more mapping work, more ethnographic work, more survey work, in-depth survey work, that's really informed by what we as sociologists would call a kind of lived everyday religion or spirituality approach, I think is something that would be really amazing to do across the region. Of course, that takes funding. So, you know, this is what we're hoping to do, is to be able to come together, combine our resources and apply for some major funding to be able to do this work. I think other things that came up today was perhaps an emphasis on mapping, on buildings, on materiality, on organizational structures, on legal issues, volunteering, social engagement, intergenerational issues. I've made a whole note for myself. One last thing I'm quite intrigued about, and we haven't talked about it at all today, but there's a wonderful book that a colleague of ours, Francois Gauthier, has just released, and it's on kind of neoliberal, the marketization of religion. His kind of argument is that the religions and the religious and spiritual social movements that are thriving at the moment, whether it's Pentecostalism, whether it's like new age spirituality type stuff. You know, it's things that are either kind of responding. It's all about things that are really responding to the market and who are sort of harnessing these market forces, but at times can also be very critical of them. So I think this relationship between Buddhism and neoliberalism and marketization, I think, is also very interesting. And particularly if interest in Western Buddhism is waning, maybe there's some disconnect going on there, or maybe Buddhism is maybe too critical or not critical enough of neoliberalism. Anyway, there's some very interesting questions there I think we could explore further. So the details there are in the chat. And then if we can also put a final slide up, there is a conference that Nantien Institute is hosting, and it's humanistic Buddhist responses to modern crises. So a very timely topic on the 6th to the 8th of November. And there are links there of how you can join this conference. Many of us who have been speakers in the webinar series are also speaking at this conference. I know I'm speaking, and my colleague Kim Lam is definitely speaking. So yes, there is a lot going on in this space this year, and a lot of it is being hosted by Nantien. So this is really wonderful to see. And so once again, please do join us and join the Nantien colleagues in hosting this wonderful upcoming event. I think that's all. Again, many, many thanks. I've gone a little over time, and thank you to our wonderful speakers. Again, Helen is here, and Venerable Lecture is here, and Sally and Mark, of course, and others who could not be here today, but who have contributed greatly to this series. All right, thank you. I think that's it.